Introduction. A world in change. Imagine living through a time when everything you took for granted about the world seems to be shifting. The balance of global power, the stability of economies, and even the value of money. Nothing stays the same forever. This is the reality that Ray Dalio, a seasoned investor and founder of one of the world's largest hedge funds, became keenly aware of. In his book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail, Dalio takes us on a journey through history and economics to understand why great nations rise to global dominance and why they eventually fall. He does this not as an academic exercise, but to help us navigate the tumultuous waters of today and tomorrow. Dalio noticed something intriguing and unsettling in recent years. Circumstances in the world economy and politics that he had never seen in his lifetime were unfolding before his eyes. Yet similar patterns had occurred many times in history. Think of factors like enormous government debts, near-zero interest rates, widening gaps between the rich and the poor, deep political divisions, and the emergence of a powerful new country challenging the established superpower. All of these were happening simultaneously in the early 21st century. This confluence reminded Dalio of other moments in history when an old order was giving way to a new one. It raised urgent questions. Are we on the brink of a major global shift? What lessons can we learn from the past to deal with what lies ahead? This summary will distill the insights from Dalio's book in an educational, engaging, and conversational way. We'll explore how economies and empires follow big cycles, recurring patterns that can span centuries, and what drives those cycles. We'll delve into the economic principles like debt, money, and trade, and social forces like wealth gaps and conflicts that shape the fortunes of nations. We'll revisit major historical examples from the Dutch and British empires to the rise of the United States and China to see these principles in action. And throughout, we'll use simple analogies and real-world examples to make these ideas easy to grasp. By the end, we'll not only understand why nations succeed and fail, but also gather some practical wisdom on how to navigate the changing world order as investors, citizens, or curious minds. The goal is to turn these big historical lessons into actionable insights for our lives today. So, get comfortable and let's embark on a journey through time and strategy, learning how past empires rose, how they crumbled, and what that means for us as we face a future of change. The big cycle, rise and fall of empires. History, Dalio argues, moves in cycles rather than straight lines. No empire, no political system, no currency, and no world order lasts forever. This might sound obvious, but it's remarkable how often people living in a dominant empire believe that their nation's preeminence will last indefinitely. It's human nature to get used to the status quo and assume it will continue. Yet, as history shows, empires rise and empires fall with a regularity that can be studied and to some extent anticipated. Dalio calls this the big cycle, an overarching pattern that typically plays out over 100 to 250 years for superpowers. Think of an empire's life cycle like the life of a person or the changing of seasons. A person is born, grows stronger and more capable in youth, reaches their peak of vitality in adulthood, and eventually experiences old age and decline. Similarly, an empire might start modestly, gain strength rapidly, enjoy a golden age of power, and then gradually, or sometimes suddenly, weaken. Or consider the seasons. Spring represents the birth of a new order, summer the peak of prosperity, autumn the signs of cooling and harvest's end, and winter the hard times of crisis and conflict that pave the way for the next spring. These analogies remind us that rise and decline are natural processes, not one-time events. Dalio's key point is that at any given moment, one country, or a small group of countries, sets the rules of the world. This is the world order. But that lead country changes over time, following the big cycle. For example, if you looked at the world around 1600, the Dutch were on the ascent. By the 1700s and 1800s, the British Empire had taken the mantle of the world's most powerful nation. By the late 20th century, the United States was unquestionably the global leader. Each of these transitions didn't happen overnight, but through a process of rise, struggle, and decline that often spanned several generations. So what drives this big cycle? Broadly, it comes down to human nature and the way societies function over time. When times are good and stability reigns, people tend to gradually forget the hardships or disciplines that brought success. Prosperity can breed complacency, entitlement, and internal discord. When times are tough, it often forces people and nations to become more disciplined, cooperative, and innovative to survive. These swings in collective behavior contribute to cycles. Each new generation, not having personally experienced the last crisis or war, can be prone to repeat mistakes or push things too far, whether it's piling up debt or fighting over power and wealth. An important part of the big cycle is that change often surprises people. As Dalio puts it, even though history repeatedly shows that no empire lasts forever, almost everyone is caught off guard and even ruined when the seemingly invincible order of their time begins to falter. It's as if a long, successful business suddenly goes bankrupt. Employees and investors are shocked, but maybe they missed warning signs that had been building up. By studying the big cycle of empires, we can better see those warning signs and not be as surprised when they appear. In the sections that follow, we'll unpack the big cycle by looking at the ingredients that help a nation rise, what happens at the peak of power, and the factors that lead to decline. Keep in mind that while we discuss these as a generalized cycle, each empire's story has its unique aspects. However, the rhymes of history, the similarities across different times and cultures are striking. By recognizing those, we gain a sort of historical X-ray vision into the present and future. Ingredients of national greatness. How does a nation go from being one among many to the world's leading power? Dalio identified several key ingredients or determinants of national success that consistently show up in the rise of great powers. These ingredients tend to reinforce each other, creating a virtuous cycle during a nation's ascent. They include education and human capital, a strong educational system, and a culture that values learning and skill development. When people become more knowledgeable and skilled, they drive innovation and economic productivity. Innovation and technology, the ability to invent and use new technologies. This includes scientific research, technological entrepreneurship, and adaptation of best practices. Innovation can dramatically boost a nation's productivity and military power. Competitiveness and cost efficiency, the capacity to produce high-quality goods and services at competitive prices. If a country's businesses can outcompete others in global markets due to better efficiency or quality, that country's economy grows in influence. Economic output, simply put, a growing and large economy measured in GDP and output per person. A nation that produces a lot of goods and services has more wealth and resources to project power. Share of global trade. Leading nations often become major trading hubs. When a country's ships, companies, or commerce reach all corners of the world, it not only creates wealth, but also spreads that nation's influence and currency. Financial center and capital markets. The development of a strong financial system, banks, stock markets, lending mechanisms often centered in a global city. Think of Amsterdam in the 17th century, London in the 19th, or New York in the 20th. Being a financial center attracts investment from around the world and gives a nation capital to fuel further growth. Military strength. It may be unfortunate, but it's true. Having a powerful military has been crucial for nations to both defend their interests and, at times, impose their will internationally. Military strength often depends on economic strength. You need money and technology for powerful armed forces, and in turn helps secure trade routes and resource access that keep the economy strong. Effective leadership and governance, values and stability, competent and relatively uncorrupt government that can make wise decisions, maintain internal stability, and invest in the future. This also includes social cohesion around common values or identity, which helps a society stay stable as it grows. Some also include reserve currency status as a feature of a top empire, that is, when other countries trust and use your currency because they see it as stable and widely accepted. This tends to happen when many of the above factors are in place: a strong economy, dominant trade position, and credible governance and financial system. For example, the Dutch guilder, British pound, and US dollar each became the world's preferred currency in their respective heydays. These factors feed into each other. Imagine a country that heavily invests in education. This produces a generation of inventors and entrepreneurs who drive innovation. Those innovations make businesses more productive, boosting economic output and giving that country an edge in competitiveness on the world stage. Higher productivity and innovation can lead to better weapons and tools, enhancing military strength. A thriving economy with global trade attracts capital, growing the nation's status as a financial center and encouraging other nations to hold its currency. It's a reinforcing loop. Success builds on success. A historical example: 17th century Netherlands, the Dutch Empire, had many of these ingredients. They were relatively small in size, but boasted perhaps the best education and literacy rates in Europe at the time, a culture that encouraged scientific inquiry and business. The Dutch were innovative. They developed advanced shipbuilding techniques, pioneered the concept of publicly traded companies and stock exchanges, and improved financial instruments like bonds and central banking. All this innovation led them to dominate trade through the Dutch East India Company and a powerful merchant fleet, which swelled their economic output. Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world in that era, and the Dutch currency, the guilder, was trusted everywhere. Protected by a capable navy, the Netherlands rose to be a world power disproportionate to its tiny size. In short, they combined all these ingredients masterfully. The takeaway is that nations on the rise typically display strength in most of these areas. They educate their people, innovate constantly, maintain competitiveness, grow their economy and trade networks, build strong institutions, including banks and markets, and ensure they can defend their interests. When you see a country checking all these boxes, you often see a nation on an upward trajectory in the global pecking order. The rise. From humble beginnings to global power. Every dominant empire starts somewhere. Often, the seeds of a future great power are planted after some sort of major upheaval, like a war or a revolution that clears the field of the old order and allows a new order to take root. In the rise phase of the big cycle, a country typically has to pull itself up through discipline, hard work, and unity, because it usually emerges from tough times. There's a saying: hard times create strong men create good times. In this context, after a period of chaos or hardship, the survivors or new leaders tend to be hardened and motivated to build a better future. In the rise phase, you often see low levels of debt, a willingness to work and save, and a focus on the future. The society is often somewhat egalitarian, or at least not extremely unequal, at this point, because the upheaval that led to a new order might have leveled the playing field somewhat. There is a widespread sense of common purpose. People remember the mistakes or excesses that caused the previous crisis and are determined not to repeat them, at least for now. For example, after a devastating civil war and foreign occupation in the late 1500s, the Dutch Republic forged a new nation with a collective will to never again be under the thumb of a foreign empire. They worked extremely hard, were frugal and industrious, and relentlessly focused on trade and enterprise. Similarly, after the American Revolution, and later after the difficulties of the early United States, like heavy debts in the 1780s, the young country embraced prudent financial management under leaders like Alexander Hamilton and a culture of invention and expansion that set the stage for its rise. During the ascent, the country's productivity soars. People are inventing things, building infrastructure, and starting businesses. The nation's output grows faster than its debts, if there are any significant debts at all. It produces more than it consumes, generating surpluses. This is like a household that always earns more than it spends over time. That household will become wealthier, especially if it reinvests the savings wisely. Nations are similar. Those early surpluses can be used to invest in more education, infrastructure, like ports, railways, nowadays maybe digital infrastructure, and military capabilities to secure trade routes and borders. Culturally, rising nations often have a sense of moral and mental strength. There's often a strong work ethic and a belief in meritocracy that the society will reward those who contribute, regardless of class or birth, at least relative to older societies. This energetic, optimistic mindset propels the nation forward. It's like the youthful phase of an empire, full of ambition and drive. We also see the importance of order and stability internally. In the rise period, the nation tends to have effective leadership and governance. Rules are fairly and consistently applied, for the most part, which encourages entrepreneurship and innovation, because people feel that if they work hard, they'll get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. The legal system, institutions, and bureaucracy strengthen in service of growth, not yet bogged down by corruption or too much infighting. A rising power also tends to be pragmatic and adaptable. Because it is up and coming, it often borrows good ideas from others or learns from other nations. Japan during the Meiji Restoration, late 1800s, is a good example in a shorter-term context. It studied Western powers to rapidly modernize. Or the United States in the 19th century adopted industrial techniques from Britain while adding its own innovations. A rising power doesn't assume it knows everything. It eagerly absorbs knowledge to catch up and surpass rivals. Economically, as the country's productivity and trade expand, its currency gains credibility and its financial sector develops. Foreign investors start to put money into this rising economy because they see opportunity. This further fuels growth, and often, by this stage, the country's currency and language start to spread beyond its borders as de facto standards in trade. Think of how the British pound was used across the world in the 19th century, or how the US dollar and English language spread globally in the late 20th during those nations' ascents. Using their currency or language became good for business for others. By the end of the rise phase, the once humble nation is now a formidable force. It has gone from perhaps a regional player to a true global power. It may have won a war or series of conflicts to secure its position against the formerly dominant empire. For instance, Britain's rise involved defeating Napoleonic France and earlier challenging the Dutch. The United States' rise was solidified after World War II, in which it emerged vastly stronger relative to other powers. Typically, a decisive conflict or event marks the transfer of leadership in the world order, a moment when it becomes clear that the torch has passed. When the dust settles, the new leading nation sets up the rules of the game. It might convene conferences to establish a new international order, like the Congress of Vienna in 1815 led by Britain and Allies, or Bretton Woods in 1944 led by the US. These rules generally encode the new realities of power, for example, establishing institutions or trade rules that favor the leading country's strengths and values, and thus a new Pax Britannica or Pax Americana, peace under British-US terms, begins. The world enters a new summer of prosperity under this new leadership. The peak of power, triumph, and excess. Reaching the top of the mountain is a tremendous achievement for any nation. At its peak, an empire enjoys prestige, wealth, and influence that is often unmatched in its history. This is the summer of the cycle, a time of plenty. The leading nation typically has the largest and most advanced economy in the world, the reserve currency that international trade and finance rely on, because people trust that currency and the stability of the nation behind it. Military supremacy, or at least the ability to project power globally more than any other country. A high standard of living for its citizens, who often benefit from cheaper and abundant goods, global investment inflows, and a strong currency that buys a lot. A network of alliances and bases or colonies that extend its influence far and wide. One could think of the United States in the couple of decades after World War II as a peak example. It produced about half of the world's economic output right after the war, had unrivaled industrial capacity, while other major countries were rebuilding from rubble, commanded overwhelming military power. It was the only country with nuclear weapons in 1945 and had by far the strongest navy and air force, and the US dollar became the linchpin of the global financial system. American citizens in the 1950s enjoyed an unprecedented level of affluence. New cars, suburban homes, new technologies like televisions, all made possible in part by America's position at the top of the world order. However, ironically, the peak of power often sows the seeds of decline. When a nation is on top, a sort of inertia or complacency can set in. It's as if the nation collectively says, "We've made it," and begins to change its behavior in subtle but important ways. Reduced competitiveness, success can lead to rising costs, wages, land regulations. Other nations, hungrier for success, learn the leading nation's techniques and start to catch up, or even do some things more efficiently. Over time, the leading country's share of global manufacturing or trade might slip as competitors gain ground. For example, by the late 1960s and 1970s, countries like Germany and Japan had rebuilt and were exporting high-quality cars and electronics, giving American industries a run for their money. High wealth and income. Inequality. As decades of prosperity pass, not everyone benefits equally. Those who own assets, like stocks, land, businesses, in the booming empire, may accumulate wealth much faster than those who rely on wages. A gap grows between the rich and the rest. At the peak, this inequality often reaches extremes. Dalio points out that in late 19th century Britain, for instance, the top 1% owned a huge majority of the wealth, and in the contemporary US, inequality has been climbing towards similarly high levels. This creates social tensions. The rich may become more disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people, and those left behind feel resentment. Emerging decadence or shifts in values. Over generations, the collective memory of the hardships it took to rise fades away. Newer generations grow up in affluence and peace, taking it for granted. The social ethos can shift from one of hard work, savings, and innovation to one of enjoyment, consumption, and even entitlement. It's like a family business that the grandparents built through grit. By the time the grandkids inherit it, they might just enjoy the profits and neglect the hard work needed to keep the business competitive. In an empire's peak, you might see more focus on luxury, leisure, and internal squabbles, rather than forging ahead in productivity. Overextension. The leading country might commit to costly endeavors to maintain its position. This could be military overreach, fighting multiple wars, or policing the world at great expense, or welfare and entitlement overreach, promising generous benefits to its populace, without a commensurate plan to pay for them long term. In the peak of the British Empire, for instance, maintaining far-flung colonies and a giant navy was incredibly expensive. For the US, fighting prolonged conflicts like Vietnam and later wars in the Middle East, alongside domestic spending, started straining resources by the late 20th century. Debt accumulation. Early in the rise, debt is low and often used productively. At the peak and heading into decline, you often see debt loads surge. Why? The country's people and government become used to a high standard of living and assume it can continue forever. The government may borrow heavily to fund its military or social programs, thinking the economic growth and tax revenues will always cover it, or that, as the indispensable nation, it can always borrow more with impunity. Consumers might also borrow more, taking on credit to buy houses, goods, etc., because they're optimistic about the future. Initially, borrowing can stimulate more growth, masking problems. But piling up debt is like adding dry leaves to a forest floor at some point. A spark, like a recession or interest rate rise, can ignite a big fire, a debt crisis. Less investment in the future. Paradoxically, a top empire can start underinvesting in the very things that made it great. Infrastructure may age without replacement. Educational outcomes might stagnate or fall behind those in other rising nations, and research might shift from fundamental breakthroughs to more incremental or financial engineering type gains. If the next generation isn't as well prepared, or if capital isn't going into new productive enterprises, the dynamism of the economy fades. So, at the peak, life still feels good, often very good for many citizens of the empire, especially those benefiting from the wealth and stability. But the warning signs are there. It's like a splendid summer where the harvest is plenty, but if you look closely, the soil is getting a bit depleted and the weather is slowly turning less favorable. In historical hindsight, we often identify these signs easily. For example, historians can point to how by 1890 or 1900, Britain's education and industrial growth was lagging behind the US and Germany, or how by the 1960s the US saw slowing growth and rising inflation and social unrest. But at the time, many people missed these indicators, distracted by the continuing apparent strength and the assumption that their country is exceptional and destined to stay on top. Warning signs: debt, inequality, and internal decay. As an empire passes its peak, the autumn of the cycle sets in a period of cooling and warning signs. Three of the most glaring signs that a leading power is in decline are excessive debt, domestic strife, often driven by inequality, and a general erosion of competitiveness and unity. Let's unpack these and why they matter. 1. Debt and financial strains. When a country has piled on debt during the good times, it eventually reaches a point where this debt becomes a burden. The government might have borrowed heavily to fund wars, public services, or just to pay interest on previous debt, a dangerous spiral. Businesses and individuals might also be over-leveraged. At first, debts can be managed because income is growing, but if the economy slows, or if interest rates rise even a bit, suddenly paying back or servicing those debts becomes much harder. The country faces tough choices. Do we cut spending drastically, austerity, raise taxes, default on debt, or print money to cover the gap? Each choice has major downsides. Historically, a common path taken is to print more money or otherwise ease money, like keeping interest rates very low, to make it easier to pay debts. This often leads to inflation and a devaluation of the currency's value over time. During a declining phase, the once mighty currency starts to lose its shine. People at home and abroad begin doubting that this country can keep its finances in check. For example, in the late stages of the British Empire, the UK had to repeatedly devalue the pound and ultimately lost its status as the world's reserve currency after World War II because it simply had too much debt and too many obligations relative to its reduced economic power. Similarly, the US in the late 1960s had accumulated debt from the Vietnam War and expansive social programs. By 1971, President Nixon took the US off the gold standard because other countries were exchanging their dollars for American gold in large quantities. They saw the US was printing too many dollars. That marked a devaluation of the dollar against gold and other currencies, an early warning that the dollar's dominance was not unshakable. 2. Wealth and values gaps. As mentioned, inequality often becomes extreme by the peak, and in decline it becomes a source of internal conflict. The rich and the rest of society begin to mistrust or even despise each other's intentions. Social cohesion phrase. It's not just wealth gaps, but also values gaps. Different groups, the wealthy elite versus working class, urban versus rural, one ethnic or religious group versus another, conservatives versus liberals, start to see the world so differently that they almost live in separate realities. They accuse each other of being the reason for the country's problems. This kind of polarization can paralyze effective governance. It becomes harder to pass sensible policies because factions would rather fight each other than compromise. History provides stark examples. Before the French Revolution, late 1780s, France had sky-high inequality. Aristocrats lived lavishly while peasants starved, and a broken financial system revolution erupted. In the 1930s, the United States saw severe wealth gaps during the Great Depression and a clash of ideologies, communists, fascists, populists, and establishment capitalists all vying for influence. That was resolved in part by the New Deal reforms, but not before great social upheaval. In the late 20th century, we saw rising inequality and political division in the Soviet Union, which contributed to its collapse in 1991. In today's context, many see the United States as dangerously divided, Republicans versus Democrats, rich versus poor, different racial and cultural tensions to a degree that civility and trust have eroded significantly. When people within a country view their fellow citizens as enemies or threats to their values, the nation's unity and strength from within crumbles. 3. Declining competitiveness and innovation. If, during the peak, the leading nation slowed down its investment in the future, the effects become evident in the decline. The nation that used to be cutting edge might now be lagging. It might still produce great things, but fewer than before relative to the size of its economy. Other nations begin to outpace it in critical industries or technologies. For instance, as Britain declined, it missed out or was late to some 20th century innovations in chemicals and automobiles where Germany or the US excelled. For the US today, there are concerns that while it leads in many tech areas, it is falling behind in things like certain manufacturing capabilities, and its education system, by some metrics, isn't keeping up, especially in STEM fields compared to, say, China. When a country ceases to be the most innovative or efficient, its economic power inevitably slips. Political and social instability, combined debt stress, inflation worries, inequality, and polarization, and you get a very combustible mix. In such times, extreme leaders and movements often appear. These can be populist leaders who claim to represent the common people against the elites, often proposing drastic measures to restore past glory or to redistribute wealth by force. Sometimes they are from the far left, promising to take from the rich, other times from the far right, promising law and order, or blaming minorities or foreigners for the country's woes. In more extreme cases, they become autocrats, undermining democratic norms to seize more control, arguing that only they can save the nation. Dalio points out that in late-stage decline, countries often flirt with authoritarianism, as chaos makes people willing to trade some freedoms for stability. For example, during the later stage of Germany's decline in the 1920s, hyperinflation and economic ruin set the stage for Adolf Hitler's rise in 1933, a populist autocrat who dismantled Germany's democracy. In the US during the 1930s, there were also figures like Huey Long, a populist Louisiana governor, who gained popularity, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced pressure and attempted to consolidate power in ways that some thought threatened the balance of institutions, though the US ultimately preserved its democracy through that era. The point is, internal turmoil opens the door for strong men or radical changes in governance. Social unrest becomes common protests, riots, sometimes outright rebellion or civil war. The situation can escalate to the point where normal politics break down entirely. In extreme decline, a nation may face revolution, where the system of government is overthrown, or civil war, where factions fight for control. Short of that, you might still see rising crime, public disorder, and general dissatisfaction that makes it hard for the country to get things done. It's important to highlight that these warning signs don't guarantee an empire's collapse. If recognized early and addressed, a decline can be managed or potentially reversed. But historically, by the time these signs are raging, the momentum is hard to fully reverse without some sort of crisis. It's as though an illness has set into the body of the empire if the patient doesn't take the cure, which might be bitter medicine like austerity, reforms, reconciliation among classes. The illness progresses. To the average person in a declining empire, this period is very confusing and stressful. They remember their country being the best and wonder why things feel so tough now, why the money doesn't go as far, why there's so much anger in politics, why their country isn't respected like it used to be, or why it's facing challenges abroad. Many cling to the hope that with a new leader or a return to old values, things will magically go back to how they were in the good old days. Others may scapegoat parts of society or foreign forces for the change. It's an emotionally charged time. In summary, the autumn of an empire is marked by skyrocketing debt, bitter divisions at home, eroding economic dominance, and a creeping sense of insecurity. It's the final warning phase. If action isn't taken to fundamentally resolve these issues, the stage is set for the winter, a period of crisis, conflict, and the end of the old order. The fall, crisis and renewal. When the pressures of decline become too great, the situation often snaps. This is the winter of the big cycle, a time of crisis that can be as frightening and chaotic as a severe winter storm, but which eventually clears the way for a new beginning. In the context of a world order, the fall of an empire typically involves financial collapse, internal conflict, and often external war, culminating in a dramatic shift in power. Financial collapse or drastic reset. Excessive debt and an untenable economic situation often lead to some kind of financial breaking point. This could be a stock market crash, a banking crisis, a currency crisis, or all of the above. Essentially, the promises that were made, debt, pensions, etc., cannot be kept, and there's a massive loss of wealth. The currency might be devalued sharply, sometimes through hyperinflation or a restructuring. Imagine waking up to find your life savings is worth half what it was, or that the government says your bonds will only pay out 50 cents on the dollar. These events are devastating for people's savings and undermine trust in the financial system. In 1931, during the Great Depression, Britain faced such a financial crisis and was forced to abandon the gold standard and devalue the pound significantly, a humiliation for a currency that once ruled the world. In 1923, Germany's Weimar Republic saw hyperinflation that destroyed the currency, wiping out the middle class's wealth in a matter of months. In 1998, Russia's government defaulted on its debts, causing chaos. These are the kinds of events that can mark the end of a financial era. For a leading empire, such a collapse typically signals that its time at the top is ending or over. Internal conflict turns violent. If the internal tensions we discussed, wealth gaps, political polarization, reach a boiling point, the outcome can be revolutionary. Perhaps extremists take over the government or a civil war erupts between factions. At minimum, the government might become very authoritarian to suppress unrest, which in turn can further weaken the economy and international standing if, say, capital flees the country, or if allies distance themselves. In some historical cases, the fall of an empire involved literal regime change, the monarchy falls, or the old constitution is thrown out. The Russian Revolution of 1917 is an example, where the declining Tsarist empire collapsed and was replaced by a completely new Bolshevik regime, which also took Russia out of its position as a great power for a while, only for the Soviet Union to later re-emerge as one. The fall of the French monarchy in 1789 to 1790 during a fiscal crisis led to years of upheaval and eventually the rise of Napoleon. In a falling empire, ordinary people might experience runs on banks, emergency laws, curfews, or martial law life can turn upside down. External war and power transition. Often, a declining empire gets into a major war with a rising power, which decisively settles who will be in charge. This is the classic Thucydides' trap scenario. A ruling power and a rising power end up in a violent conflict that usually one wins and the other loses badly. World War I and World War II can be seen through this lens. Britain and its allies, including a rising US, versus Germany, an up-and-coming challenger in Europe, in World War I, and then again the established global powers, Britain, now joined by the US and Soviet Union, versus the challengers, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, in World War II. The result of those wars left Britain exhausted and broke, unable to maintain its empire, and propelled the US, and to an extent the USSR, into superpower status. Not every transition involves a direct war between the old and new power. For instance, the US and UK never went to war with each other during the handover of global leadership. Instead, they were allies in war against others, though one could argue the world wars served as the necessary conflict that changed the guard. But war or no war, the end of an order often sees violence. If the declining empire isn't directly fighting the rising one, it might be fighting someone else and losing, like a war it can't win, sapping its strength, for example, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Or the rising power might engage in war to grab territory or status as soon as the old power shows weakness. The end of the old order. When the dust settles from economic meltdown and war, the result is usually a new beginning. A new order is established, often quite different from the old. Sometimes the capital of world finance shifts from Amsterdam to London to New York, as happened over the centuries. New international rules or institutions are set up by the winners. The old champion might be down, but not always completely out. For example, Britain lost its top status, but remained an important country, just no longer number one. The key point is that the baton passes leadership moves onto a new country or set of countries that will guide the next era. This period is extraordinarily painful for those living through it. It often involves sacrifice, loss of wealth, even loss of lives in conflict. It's a humbling period for the once dominant nation. They have to come to terms with a reduced role in the world. But for the world as a whole, these periods of clear-out, as harrowing as they are, plant the seeds for eventual recovery. Just as winter, for all its barrenness, is preparing the ground for spring, a crisis resets many imbalances. Debts might be wiped out, inefficient old structures removed, etc. Take the example of the Great Depression and World War II. It was an awful, traumatizing time globally. Yet out of it came a new order, the Bretton Woods system, the United Nations, unprecedented economic growth in the 1950s and 1960s under US leadership, and the rebuilding of Europe and Japan. Those achievements were possible because the slate had been partly wiped clean, and there was a resolve to not repeat the mistakes, at least for a while. For the nation that fell, sometimes they managed to reform and find a sustainable place in the new order, like the UK did as a US ally and by eventually stabilizing its economy. Or they might descend into long-term stagnation or chaos if they don't adapt, like the Ottoman Empire after its fall remained weak and eventually was dissolved, though Turkey later emerged as a modern nation. The main lesson of the fall phase is that change finally comes in a hard, unmistakable way. The illusions that things can go on as before are shattered. What remains is who adapts and who leads next, and thus history moves on to the next cycle, with a new leading power and a world reordered under new realities. It's worth noting that Dalio doesn't describe this cycle to preach doom and gloom, but to show that while these falls are terrible, they are also times that give birth to the next rise. The key is whether we can learn and perhaps make the transitions less devastating by seeing them coming. Money, credit, and the long-term debt cycle. Let's take a closer look at one of the fundamental drivers that underpins much of what we've discussed: money and debt. Dalio has a famous concept called the long-term debt cycle. This is a pattern that typically lasts on the order of 50 to 100 years and ties in closely with the rise and fall of economies and empires. While the big cycle of world orders might be 200 plus years, within that, and sometimes aligning with it, are these financial cycles that can build up and break down. Imagine starting with a fresh monetary system, perhaps after a big war or crisis. At the beginning, people are cautious with lending and borrowing. Money might be tied to something tangible like gold, often called hard money because its supply is naturally limited. In this environment, debt levels are low because people either don't trust lending much yet or are wary of borrowing too much. Memories of the last debt crisis are fresh. However, as stability returns and growth picks up, confidence rises. Banks and investors start to lend more. Perhaps a government issues some debt to invest in rebuilding, or businesses borrow to expand, and it all works out, the economy grows, and they repay the loans. This success makes everyone a bit more comfortable with debt. Over decades, credit keeps expanding. People figure, well, I can lend more than I have in gold, because not everyone will demand gold at the same time, which effectively creates more money via credit. Like how modern banks operate: you deposit $100, the bank loans out $90 of it to someone else. Effectively, money is created as credit in the system. This is the mid-cycle boom. Debt is growing faster than actual money reserves, like gold or base money, but it seems fine because the economy is growing, perhaps even because of the credit growth. Easy credit can stimulate spending and investment. Asset prices often rise in this phase. Stocks, real estate, etc. go up because people are buying them, often with borrowed money, expecting future growth to justify it. It can be a euphoric time. Think of the roaring 20s in the US or the housing boom of the 2000s. Credit was easy and everything seemed great. But trees don't grow to the sky. Eventually, debts reach a level where people start to question, will all these loans really be repaid? Maybe a shock happens. It could be rising interest rates, making debt costlier to service, or a geopolitical event, or simply too many people defaulting on loans they shouldn't have gotten. This triggers a debt crisis. Suddenly, banks tighten lending. Those who need to refinance their loans can't, and some institutions might collapse. People panic and try to sell assets to raise cash, causing asset prices to plummet, market crash. This is a typical short-term debt cycle, like a recession, but if it's big enough and debt levels are extreme, it becomes a long-term debt cycle peak, meaning the system itself has to be reset. At that point, the country faces a dilemma: either let everything collapse, mass defaults, which means lenders and savers lose a lot and the economy tanks, or intervene in some way. Often the response is for the central bank or government to print money and lower interest rates a lot to prevent a complete collapse. Printing money in modern terms means things like buying bonds, quantitative easing, or literally injecting new money into banks. This floods the system with money to replace the credit that vanished. It helps stop the freefall, but it also means the currency is now less scarce, so it eventually devalues. If the crisis is really bad, a country might abandon a gold standard, like the US did in 1933 during the Great Depression, or again in 1971 as mentioned. This essentially means turning money into pure fiat currency money that isn't backed by gold or anything physical, just government decree. Fiat allows for more flexibility. You can print as needed. But it also means you can overprint, which can lead to high inflation or hyperinflation if done recklessly. Dalio notes that in the long-term debt cycle, after a major crisis and money printing, usually the slate is somewhat wiped clean. Debts might be restructured or just inflated away. For instance, if prices double due to inflation, a $100 debt from before is now worth only half as much in real terms. People who held cash or bonds lose purchasing power, and people who had debt might get some relief through default or inflation. It's painful for creditors and savers, but it reduces the overall debt burden relative to the economy. After that, a new cycle can begin, often back with some discipline, maybe even a new monetary system. The post-World War II Bretton Woods system pegged currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold, imposing some discipline again after the chaos of the interwar period. That lasted until debts built up too high by the late 60s, early 70s, and the US left gold. Now we're in a purely fiat money world since 1971. Dalio implies that we're perhaps nearing the end of the current long-term debt cycle, as global debts are historically high, and interest rates reached zero, meaning central banks did as much as they could to stimulate. Throughout history, no currency maintains its value forever. The Spanish silver coins that once dominated trade in the 1600s are gone. The Dutch guilder is gone. The British pound, while still around, is not the king it once was and has lost something like 99% of its value in gold terms over 2 centuries. The US dollar, too, has lost about 90+% of its purchasing power in a century, a combination of normal inflation and periodic devaluations. Typically, a top currency lasts as the standard for trade and reserves for about 100 years, give or take, aligning with the period of that nation's dominance. When the empire falls, or when its debt and money problems accumulate, the currency falls with it. Sometimes its slow decline, the pound gradually lost ground to the dollar over the first half of the 20th century, and sometimes it's sudden. The French assignat during the Revolution in the 1790s became nearly worthless in a few years. For individuals and investors, Dalio's tale of the debt cycle carries a warning. If you hold all your wealth in a currency that is being printed a lot to cover debts, you might do poorly. It also underscores the importance of hard assets or diversified assets as protection, like gold historically, or real estate, or other currencies. But more on practical takeaways later. In summary, the long-term debt cycle is like a heartbeat of the financial system: long periods of build-up, borrowing and complacency growing, then a dramatic contraction, crisis, and reset. Importantly, when this financial heartbeat coincides with the end of a big geopolitical cycle, like an empire's decline, that is when you get the most dramatic changes in world order. And it's precisely this kind of convergence of factors that Dalio worries the world might be facing now: internal order and disorder, keeping a nation together. We've talked about the economics now. Let's focus more deeply on the social and political fabric inside a nation, which Dalio refers to in terms of internal order and disorder. If the economic foundation is like the engine of a car, the internal order is like the condition of the car's body, and the cooperation of the people inside it. Are they working together to keep the car running, or are they fighting over the steering wheel? A nation's internal order is characterized by how peaceful, cooperative, and law-abiding the society is, and how well the system of government functions to maintain stability and fairness. In good times, often early in the rise and during the peak, internal order is strong, institutions are respected, the rule of law is upheld, and even if there are different classes or parties, they generally resolve differences without violence. There's a sense that everyone is benefiting, if not equally, at least sufficiently that most are content. However, as circumstances change, especially in the declining phase, internal order can break down. Let's break down the elements of internal disorder. Wealth gaps. We covered this, but to reiterate, when the gap between the haves and have-nots becomes too large, social cohesion suffers. It's not purely economic, it becomes emotional and moral. The wealthy might be seen as greedy or as having unfair advantages, while the poor might be accused of being lazy or a drain on society. This mutual resentment can boil over. Values gaps. People start to cluster into tribes defined by ideology, religion, region, or ethnicity. They then develop narratives about why other groups are holding the country back or threatening its future. For instance, one group might value tradition and another demands change. One might stress individual liberty and another social equality. These values can conflict, and if everyone is zero-sum about it, that is, my group can only win if yours loses, then normal political compromise breaks down. Government ineffectiveness. As polarization increases, governments often become paralyzed. Passing budgets, reforms, or any long-term plans becomes harder because factions would rather block each other than allow a win for their rivals. In extreme cases, even basic functions like filling judicial positions or keeping government services running become contentious. This was seen in the lead-up to many revolutions and breakdowns. Governments become gridlocked or start losing authority over parts of the population. Rising populism. Populists capitalize on the frustration. They often use simple, emotive language to blame the elites or certain groups for the common person's woes. They promise to take down the establishment or return power to the people, often defined narrowly as their in-group. Populism isn't inherently left or right. It's more of a style and logic of politics that can veer to either end of the spectrum. What populists share is an anti-status quo fervor. In the US decline context, you had populists on the right, like Father Coughlin or Huey Long in the 1930s, or more recently figures like Donald Trump, and on the left, like some socialist movements or Occupy Wall Street sentiments. They thrive on the idea that something is fundamentally unfair and needs drastic change. Authoritarian temptation. When society feels like it's spinning apart, many people become willing to accept a strongman or some suspension of democratic norms to set things right. This is when a democracy might turn into a dictatorship, or when an existing authoritarian regime, if it's an autocratic country in decline, might double down on oppression. The populace might support these moves out of fear of chaos or out of anger towards a scapegoated group. Conflict escalation. All these factors can lead to violence, perhaps sporadic at first, street clashes, government crackdown on protests, but potentially escalating into full-blown conflict like a coup d'etat or civil war. A country at civil war is obviously at extreme internal disorder at that point. It's often no longer a single unified country in any meaningful sense until the conflict resolves one way or another. Maintaining internal order requires wise leadership that can adapt to changing conditions. For example, in some historical cases, reforms and concessions were made that diffused tensions and avoided a revolution. Britain in the 19th century had major internal challenges, like pressure for more voting rights, workers' rights, etc., but it managed to pass gradual reforms, expanding suffrage, improving labour conditions, which helped avoid a violent revolution like those that hit France or Russia. The US in the 1930s under FDR took a path of reform, New Deal programs, financial regulation, social safety nets, which arguably saved American capitalism by improving conditions for the struggling and thereby reducing the appeal of more radical alternatives. Dalio emphasizes that managing internal conflict is crucial. A nation that can navigate through internal conflicts, perhaps by finding compromise or a unifying vision, can maintain its strength and prolong its prosperity. But if a nation fails to manage these, it essentially becomes its own worst enemy, tearing itself apart from within. History suggests that internal rot is often the bigger reason for an empire's fall than pure external conquest. Rome, for instance, was already crumbling from within, politically and economically, by the time barbarians delivered the final blows. The British Empire was weakened by 2 grueling world wars, and its own war weariness and debts, such that it couldn't hold its empire together when independence movements and other powers challenged it. For citizens, the takeaway is to be aware of these internal tensions. It is in everyone's interest that they be addressed constructively through dialogue, reform, or shared sacrifice, rather than let fester until they explode. In the context of our own time, think of issues like the wealth gap or political polarization. These are not just social issues, they're signals of potentially bigger problems down the road if not dealt with. Dalio would likely say leaders and individuals alike should work on bridging gaps, finding common ground, and ensuring the system is perceived as fair to avoid the worst-case outcomes. External rivalry, the battle for global supremacy. While internal dynamics are playing out, nations exist in a world with other nations, each with their own ambitions. Thus, alongside the internal cycle, there's an external cycle, the ebb and flow of power between countries, and sometimes violent clashes that reset the global order. When one nation is dominant and others are relatively weaker, the dominant power can enforce a kind of order. This might not be a just or equal order, but it is a framework. Think of it as the rules of a game set by the champion. For example, during the height of British power, Britain's navy ensured freedom for them to navigate and trade globally. They suppressed piracy and the slave trade, eventually, largely because it aligned with their interests and values to do so. They also imposed unequal treaties on places like China because they could. That was the British-led order. In the American-led order post-1945, the US has pushed for free trade, spread capitalism and democratic ideals, at least in rhetoric, set up institutions like the IMF and World Bank to follow principles it favoured, and used alliances like NATO to maintain a balance of power favourable to it. However, no international order goes unchallenged. Other nations grow and eventually test the limits or unfairness of the status quo. If a rising power finds the current order disadvantageous, or if it simply grows confident enough to want a bigger say, tensions mount. Dalio outlines several ways great powers clash short of outright war. Trade wars, conflicts over tariffs and quotas to gain economic advantage or protect domestic industries. We've seen this recently with the US and China slapping tariffs on each other's goods. Technology wars, battles for control of high-tech industries, like restricting rivals' access to critical technologies, for example, limiting exports of advanced microchips or telecom equipment. Capital and financial wars, using the financial system as a weapon, such as sanctioning a rival country's banks, freezing assets, or cutting off access to international payment systems. This can also involve countries dumping each other's currencies or debts to make a point. Geopolitical maneuvering, competing for influence through diplomacy, forming alliances, or aiding proxies in conflicts. It's a chess game of encircling or undermining the opponent's allies and shoring up one's own positions. For example, building military bases or forging trade pacts that exclude the rival. Cyber and information warfare, a modern type of conflict, where countries hack each other's institutions, steal secrets, or spread propaganda and disinformation to weaken adversaries without direct confrontation. Military standoffs and skirmishes. Short of full war, this can involve arms races, building up nuclear arsenals, for instance, or localized clashes, like naval incidents in disputed waters, which test resolve but don't necessarily escalate to total war unless mismanaged. The reason many of these non-shooting conflicts happen is that going straight to war is extremely risky and costly in the modern era. Nuclear-armed powers, especially, are deterred from direct war because it could be catastrophic for everyone. So they engage in these other forms of conflict to advance their interests. Yet historically, when the stakes get high, military confrontation has often occurred. A rising power becoming too strong can cause the established power to consider a preemptive strike, or the rising power might try to forcibly take what it feels it's being unfairly denied. The concept of a Thucydides trap suggests that war between a rising and ruling power is more likely than not, unless extraordinary measures are taken to avoid it. In today's context, the most watched great power rivalry is America versus China. We already see elements of all 5 types of non-shooting conflicts. The US and China have engaged in a trade war in recent years. The US has limited China's access to certain technologies, like advanced semiconductor equipment, and China is trying to build independence in tech. Financially, the US has a lot of leverage with the dollar's dominance, and China is working on alternatives, like promoting its yuan and building systems with Russia or others to trade outside the dollar. Geopolitically, the US is strengthening alliances in Asia, with Japan, India, Australia, etc., while China is extending its reach via projects like the Belt and Road Initiative and increasing its influence in organizations and regions the US has paid less attention to. We regularly hear about cyber espionage and hacking incidents between the two and others. The fear is that a miscalculation could lead to a military flashpoint, the most worrisome being over Taiwan, which China considers a renegade province and is determined to eventually unify with the mainland, while the US has signaled it might defend Taiwan's autonomy. Such a conflict could draw in other nations and escalate. Dalio notes that the global external order at any time is basically set by who has the most raw power, military, economic, technological, and the will to use it. Institutions like the UN or international law are only as strong as the major powers allow them to be. When power is roughly balanced and contested, the world tends to divide into blocks, for example, during the Cold War. When power is clearly unipolar, like the US right after 1991, one country can heavily influence the rules worldwide. When the power balance is shifting, that's when instability is greatest, because the old rules are being questioned and new rules aren't yet established. The ultimate outcome of external rivalry could be one side wins decisively through war or simply outlasting the other, and a new order is set by the victor. A negotiated new balance where they find ways to coexist or share influence, perhaps by dividing spheres of influence, historically rare without conflict, but not impossible. A collapse of one or both. Sometimes a rivalry ends not by one winning, but by one imploding. For example, the Soviet Union collapsed internally, effectively handing the US a win in the Cold War. without a direct superpower war. For those of us living through such times, understanding external rivalry helps explain many events: currency fluctuations, news about military exercises, shifting alliances, even why our country's leadership is making certain decisions. It underscores why stability shouldn't be taken for granted. Peace is often maintained by a balance, sometimes a tense one, that can tip. However, being aware of these dynamics means we can also hope and push for strategies to manage them. For instance, confidence-building measures between rivals, arms control treaties, or economic codependence, which makes conflict mutually harmful, are ways that might mitigate the risk of war. History is full of both tragic clashes and surprisingly peaceful transitions. Our collective choices influence which path we take. Lessons from history: the Dutch, the British, and the American orders. To bring these concepts to life, Dalio's book walks through about 500 years of history, focusing on major cases where world leadership changed. Let's briefly travel through these eras and highlight how the cycles played out in each. The Dutch Empire, 1600s. The Netherlands in the 16th century started as a collection of provinces under the thumb of the mighty Spanish Empire. Through the 80 Years' War, a protracted struggle for independence that ended in 1648, the Dutch not only secured freedom from Spain, but emerged as an economic powerhouse. In the 17th century, the Dutch Golden Age, the Netherlands became the center of global commerce and finance. They had the world's most advanced merchant fleet, dominated trade routes, and established colonies and trading posts from the Americas to Asia. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, was the world's first major multinational corporation and helped the Dutch corner valuable trade in spices, silk, and other goods. Amsterdam became the world's financial capital, pioneering modern banking and stock trading. Culturally, it was a time of great artists like Rembrandt and scientists reflecting a vibrant, confident society. The Dutch rise embodied the cycle's early stages: strong education and skills, innovation in ship design, navigation, finance, increasing economic output and trade, and military might, especially naval, to protect their interests. The Dutch guilder became the world's preferred currency in trade due to the Netherlands' stability and wealth. They were a small country achieving outsized influence. However, their dominance didn't go unchallenged. England, later Great Britain, was a rising power in the 17th century, and the two engaged in a series of naval Anglo-Dutch wars. Over time, Britain's resources, being larger, and its own growing naval prowess, started to turn the tide. The Dutch also got entangled in costly conflicts with France and other neighbours, which strained their finances. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, the Dutch were losing ground. London surpassed Amsterdam as a financial centre. The knockout blow came during the Napoleonic Wars in the late 18th century. The Netherlands was overrun by France. Though the French were eventually defeated with British help, the era of Dutch primacy was over. The baton had passed largely to the British. The British Empire, 1700s and 1800s. Britain's ascent actually began in the 18th century and hit full stride in the 19th. After defeating major rivals, France was subdued after the Napoleonic Wars by 1815. Britain became the world's unchallenged superpower for a time. It led the Industrial Revolution inventors like James Watt, steam engine, and industries like textile manufacturing propelled Britain's economy ahead of others. With industrialization, Britain could produce goods on a scale and at a cost no one else could match initially, giving it a huge trade advantage. British exports flooded the world, and the nation amassed wealth. Militarily, the Royal Navy was the strongest in the world. This allowed Britain to police sea lanes and expand an empire on which the sun never set. They acquired colonies and influence across India, Africa, the Middle East, the Americas, and Asia Pacific. Key colonies like India provided raw materials and markets for British goods, further fueling growth. By the late 1800s, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the globe's land and population in some form. The British pound sterling became the world's leading currency. Global finance often flowed through London. British banks financed railways and infrastructure worldwide. Culturally, British institutions, parliamentary systems, English language, etc., spread widely. However, as we know, British dominance had its sunset. By the late 19th century, others were catching up. The United States, after its Civil War, 1861-65, grew rapidly into an economic giant, eventually surpassing Britain's GDP by the end of the century. Germany unified in 1871 and industrialized swiftly, becoming a leader in chemicals, machinery, and with its own colonial ambitions. Britain also started showing internal strains, huge inequality, a small elite owning most wealth, and some stagnation in old industries. It faced resistance in its colonies and competitors in trade. The early 20th century brought Britain to a stress test. World War I, 1914-1918. Britain and its allies won, but at an unfathomable cost. The British economy was wrecked by war debts. It had borrowed heavily, especially from the US, to fund the fight. The human toll was also enormous, with a generation scarred. The interwar period saw Britain trying to maintain its empire, but under great pressure. They went back on the gold standard, then had to drop it, and struggled through the Great Depression. Then World War II, 1939-1945, hit. Britain was on the winning side again, but this time victory left it essentially bankrupt and physically exhausted. The US had to aid Britain during the war, Lend-Lease, and after the war, the US took the lead in Western recovery, Marshall Plan, etc. Britain could no longer afford its empire. Within a few years, India and Pakistan gained independence, 1947. And over the following decades, nearly all other colonies became independent nations. The world's financial center shifted decisively to New York, and the dollar took over from the pound as the key currency, cemented by Bretton Woods agreements during and after World War II. In the big cycle, this was Britain's fall from the top spot. It's important to note Britain didn't fall apart as a country. It reinvented itself as a modern nation-state without an empire, still reasonably wealthy and influential, but no longer the rule-maker for the world. The handoff was to the United States, the American order, 1900s, 2000s. The US had a unique rise. By 1900, it was already the largest economy, but it was somewhat isolationist and not yet projecting power globally in the way European empires did. World War I saw the US intervene late and tilt the balance, emerging as a creditor to Europe. In the 1920s, the US enjoyed a boom, the Roaring Twenties, but then the Great Depression struck, 1929 onwards, showing some internal fragility. This was a kind of mid-cycle debt crisis for the US, which led to major reforms, FDR's New Deal, and a period of internal struggle, but ultimately the US held together. World War II was the catalyst that propelled the US to the top for good. The US mobilized its immense industrial capacity to become the arsenal of democracy, supplying not only itself, but allies with weapons and goods. Unlike Britain or the Soviet Union, the US homeland was largely untouched by destruction, except Pearl Harbor. By 1945, the US had around 50% of the world's economic output, 3/4 of global gold reserves, an unrivaled military power. It was the first nuclear power and had the world's largest navy and air force. The US then took the lead in establishing the post-war order. It helped create the United Nations, with headquarters in the US, designed the Bretton Woods monetary system, making the dollar central, and founded institutions like the World Bank and IMF. Politically, it led the Western Bloc in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, championing free market capitalism and, imperfectly, democracy as a model. Internally, after the war, the US had a period of high unity and prosperity. The American middle class thrived in the 1950s and 60s. The GI Bill educated millions of veterans. Infrastructure like highways was built. Science advanced. Space race, etc. US culture, from Hollywood to rock and roll, had global influence. This was the peak or summer of the US cycle in many respects. Challenges arose. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War, civil rights conflicts, and economic stresses, inflation, oil shocks in the 1970s, shook things up. The US went off gold in 1971, as mentioned, due to debt and gold outflow pressures. Inflation and unemployment spiked in the 1970s, stagflation. Yet the US showed resilience. The 1980s and 90s saw a reassertion of American strength. Inflation was tamed, the economy innovated, personal computers, early internet, and crucially, the Cold War ended with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The US stood as the lone superpower in a unipolar world. The 1990s were another boom, especially with the tech stock surge. Many thought the American system had definitively won history at that point. But history didn't stop. By the 2000s and 2010s, new issues came. Terrorism and costly wars. The 9/11 attacks, 2001, led the US into long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars expended trillions of dollars and much focus, arguably with limited benefit. Financial imbalances. The US had progressively cut taxes and increased spending, leading to growing federal debt, especially under the surface due to future entitlement obligations. In 2008, a debt-fueled housing bubble burst, causing a global financial crisis that started in the US. It was met with massive money printing, Federal Reserve interventions to prevent collapse, rising inequality. From the 1980s onward, wages for the average worker grew much more slowly than incomes of the wealthy, exploding the wealth gap. By the 2010s, this became a prominent social issue. Polarized politics. Differences between the major political parties widened. Cooperation in Congress dropped. Social media amplified divisions. Trust in institutions declined. The 2016 election and its aftermath demonstrated how divided the country had become on fundamental values and vision. China's rise. During the same period, the US inadvertently midwifed a peer competitor by integrating China into the global economy, bringing it into the WTO in 2001, for example. Many US businesses benefited from China's labor and market, but by the 2010s, it was clear China was not liberalizing politically, as some expected. Instead, it was growing more assertive. So, by the 2020s, the US finds itself still immensely powerful, but facing the classic late-cycle combo of high debt, internal discord, and a strong external rival. Dalio observes that the US now has to manage a relative decline. It doesn't mean an absolute collapse. Recall, the British Empire fell, but Britain reinvented itself. The US could decline gradually while remaining a leading nation, just not sole hegemon. Or it could, if it overcomes its internal issues, rejuvenate some of its strength, as it has surprised the world before by bouncing back. China's emergence. While not yet the world order leader, China is crucial to mention. In Dalio's framework, China is a rising power, potentially on track to challenge and maybe overtake the US. It's interesting because China's story includes a previous rise and fall. Centuries ago, China was a leading civilization. Then it declined sharply in the 19th century under Western pressure, and internal dysfunction. The current rise started after 1978, when Deng Xiaoping's reforms opened China's market. In just 4 decades, China went from poverty to the world's factory to an innovation hub in certain fields. It lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, built cities and infrastructure unprecedented in scale, and amassed significant wealth, second largest economy, by some measures already the largest. It's also been accumulating military power and has a clear strategic vision of regaining its historical prominence. President Xi Jinping often talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. China's rise has been so rapid that it compressed what took others a century into mere decades. It's now bumping up against the US-led order, hence trade wars, tech competition, etc. How China manages challenges like its own debt issues, an aging population, or international pushback, and how the US responds will largely script the next chapter of the world order story. From these historical cases, a few universal lessons emerge. When a nation invests in the 8 key determinants, education, innovation, etc., it tends to rise. When it falls into complacency, overextends, and racks up debt while neglecting internal harmony, it tends to decline. Transitions of power often involve conflict, but the severity can vary. Sometimes a smooth handoff is possible, like Britain to US was relatively peaceful in the transfer itself. Other times it's through catastrophic war, like World War II, or the wars that marked the Dutch to British transition. No country is an exception to these dynamics. Each might tell itself it's special. The British had rule Britannia. The Americans have American exceptionalism, but the patterns catch up unless consciously countered. Studying these cases is not to admire or condemn any particular empire, but to get clues about the present and future. It helps us see where in the cycle we might be for the current leading powers and rising ones, and it sharpens our intuition for what might come next if course isn't corrected. The current crossroads, US and China in the 21st century. Bringing the discussion to the present and near future, we stand at a pivotal moment that in many ways resembles earlier periods of major change. The United States, which has led the world order since the mid-20th century, is facing serious internal and external tests. China, after decades of unprecedented growth, is positioning itself to potentially become the next center of the world order. How this plays out will affect everyone on the planet. Let's compare some key strengths and weaknesses of the US and China today through Dalio's lens. In terms of innovation and technology, the US has long been the front runner with its culture of entrepreneurship, world-class universities, and heavy R&D investment. Silicon Valley, for example, has been a fountain of innovation. Think Apple, Google, biotech firms, etc. China, however, is catching up fast. It leads in areas like 5G telecom infrastructure, with companies like Huawei, is making strides in artificial intelligence, benefiting from vast amounts of data and government focus, and dominates certain newer industries, like drone manufacturing, high-speed rail, and green energy technologies such as solar panels. Both countries are vying for supremacy in critical fields like AI, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing. The US still has an edge in many cutting-edge areas, but China is no longer just an imitator. It's becoming an innovator in its own right. Education and human capital. The US has a mix. Its higher education, universities, are among the best, attracting talent globally, but its primary and secondary education outcomes are uneven, and in STEM fields the US produces fewer graduates than China. China has emphasized education greatly. It produces a vast number of engineers and scientists each year. Chinese students excel in international math and science tests, reflecting a rigorous schooling system, though often criticized for rote learning. Additionally, many Chinese students have studied abroad, especially in the US, and are bringing that expertise home. A challenge for China is fostering creativity and critical thinking at scale, not just test-taking skills, but they are aware of this and trying to reform. The US, on the other hand, faces challenges in upgrading its K-12 education and making it more equitable. Economic scale and output. The US economy is large and diversified, with strong service and tech sectors and a robust agricultural output. China's economy, by purchasing power, is already larger, and by the nominal exchange rate is the second largest, and on track to possibly overtake the US in size within a decade or two. China is the manufacturing workshop of the world, and it's now moving up to produce higher value goods, cars, aircraft parts, advanced electronics. The US remains very productive per worker, but overall growth in recent years has been modest, except for the tech sector. China's growth rates have been higher, though naturally slowing as it gets larger. A key difference: the US is a richer nation per person, around $65K GDP per capita, while China is about $10K per capita, meaning it still has room to grow by improving the average wealth of its huge population. Trade and financial influence. China is the largest trading partner for many countries around the world, thanks to its massive export machine and voracious appetite for commodities. It has used initiatives like the Belt and Road, building infrastructure in other countries, to deepen economic ties. The US is still a major trader, but it's relatively more self-contained than China. The US economy relies a bit less on exports as a share of GDP. Financially, Wall Street and the dollar give the US unparalleled influence. Companies and countries need access to US capital markets, and many global transactions clear through US influence systems. China is working to internationalize its currency, the yuan, and has set up its own financial institutions, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, etc., to complement or rival Western-led ones. But trust in China's financial system isn't as high globally due to concerns about transparency and government controls. Military and strategic position. The US military, with its global network of bases and alliances, is still dominant. The US Navy ensures freedom of navigation in most seas, or, from another perspective, can blockade others if needed. The US also has a strong edge in experience. It's been involved in many conflicts, for better or worse, and learned from them. China's military was until recently focused on territorial defense and regional issues. Over the past 2 decades, China has rapidly built up its forces, especially its navy, missile forces, and technology, like anti-satellite weapons and cyber units. Strategically, China's focus is first on its near abroad, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, pushing the US gradually out of what it sees as its sphere. The US, meanwhile, is trying to reinforce its commitments to allies in Asia-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, Australia, etc., to counterbalance China. A complicating factor. Nuclear weapons on both sides make direct war something leaders desperately want to avoid, but that doesn't eliminate the risk of incidents or proxy conflicts. Internal stability and governance. The US is a democracy with significant polarization. Its strength is that it has a self-correcting mechanism, elections, free press, active civil society, but that can also lead to policy swings and gridlock. China is an authoritarian one-party state. Its strength is the ability to execute long-term plans decisively, like building massive infrastructure or enacting industrial policy quickly. But its weakness is the potential lack of feedback. If the government makes a mistake or there's public discontent, it doesn't have the safety valve of elections or free expression, which can lead to repression or eventually sudden instability as pressure builds. As of now, China's Communist Party has strong control and uses nationalism and economic growth to legitimize itself, but it is wary of the kind of internal chaos that once led to the Soviet collapse or China's own turbulent cultural revolution in the 1960s. The US has social strains that sometimes erupt, protests, etc., but it also has a resilient civic fabric at local levels and many institutional checks and balances. The question is whether those will hold if, say, election disputes intensify or if extreme factions gain more power. The multi-front struggle between the US and China can be summarized through recent developments. Trade war. Starting around 2018, the US began imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, citing unfair trade practices and large trade deficits. China retaliated with its own tariffs. This tit-for-tat affected industries from agriculture, US soybeans, etc., to tech components. It somewhat dented bilateral trade and raised prices for some consumers and companies, but also pushed some supply chains to diversify out of China. As of now, many tariffs remain in place. Tech war. The US has banned Chinese tech companies like Huawei and ZTE from certain markets, cut off Huawei's access to advanced semiconductors, and pressured allies to exclude Chinese 5G gear. It's also moved to restrict AI and supercomputing chips. China, in return, has accelerated efforts to develop its own chip industry and is cautious about using US tech, for example, promoting local software and hardware. Both countries have also been scrutinizing each other's software apps, like the debate in the US about banning TikTok, a Chinese-owned app. Financial moves. The US has threatened and occasionally implemented financial sanctions on Chinese entities for human rights issues or ties to Iran, North Korea, etc. It also added Chinese companies to blacklists that prevent US investment in them. China has reduced its holdings of US Treasury bonds somewhat, partly to diversify, partly to avoid being too exposed. The Chinese yuan is slowly growing in international use. Some countries now do bilateral trade with China in yuan, but global investors still largely trust the dollar and euro more for now. Geopolitical tensions. Examples include the South China Sea, where China's building of artificial islands with runways and missile installations has prompted US Navy freedom of navigation operations to assert those waters are international. Hong Kong's political crackdown, Beijing imposing a strict security law in 2020, created friction, with the US responding by removing Hong Kong's special trade status and sanctioning some officials. The status of Tibet and Xinjiang, with international criticism of China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims, also draws moral pressure from the US and others, which China decries as interference. Alliances and partnerships. The US has been strengthening the Quad, a strategic dialogue with Japan, India, and Australia, as a sort of counterweight to China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. It also signed AUKUS, a new security pact with the UK and Australia, to help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines, explicitly seen as a move to contain China's naval expansion. China, for its part, has grown closer to Russia, symbolically and via energy deals, improved ties with some countries in Asia and Africa through investment, and continues to court countries to isolate Taiwan diplomatically, convincing some nations to switch recognition from Taiwan to Beijing. Global leadership narratives. The US frames its stance as defending a rules-based international order that respects sovereignty, human rights, and open commerce, though critics might note inconsistencies in US behavior. China frames its rise as a return to rightful prominence and often pitches itself as a champion of the developing world, with slogans like win-win cooperation and a community of common destiny. Chinese leaders often argue that countries should be free to choose their own path without Western moralizing, implying China won't pressure them on human rights, etc., as long as they don't challenge China's core interests. This appeals to some governments tired of Western conditionalities. All this sets the stage for the coming years. Dalio does not predict exact outcomes, but he raises probabilities. The risk of a major crisis is at its highest in decades because of the combination of economic, internal, and external pressures. He likens the present to the 1930s to 40s, a time of high debt and low interest rates, like the Great Depression era, huge wealth gaps, rising populism, fascism then, paralleling polarization now, and a rising power, then Germany, Japan, now China, challenging an order, all culminating in World War II. Today, instead of Germany, Japan, it's China, and perhaps other powers like Russia in a smaller role, challenging the US-led order. Instead of the Great Depression, we had the Great Recession and a pandemic shock. The ingredients are there, though history might not bake the same cake. He points out a crucial difference. Nuclear weapons make direct war between major powers far more dangerous now. This could either deter war entirely, or, if war happens, make it exponentially worse for humanity. So perhaps the conflict will remain economic, technological, a sort of Cold War 2.0, unless mismanagement leads to open war. Internally, he warns that if the US doesn't get its domestic act together, find common ground, invest in the future, manage debt inflation, it could decline faster. Similarly, China's internal issues, like a real estate bubble, the need for political reform as its society modernizes, could trip it up. Thus, the race is as much about who can fix their own weaknesses as about who can outdo the other externally. For the global public, this rivalry will affect jobs, prices, security, and the media narratives we hear. It will shape where investments flow and which languages and cultures gain influence. It might even impact the world's approach to global problems like climate change. Will the US and China compete on going green, which could be good for everyone, or will they use things like energy as pawns in their rivalry? The hope is that awareness of these patterns helps policymakers avoid past mistakes. There's talk of trying to establish guardrails US and Chinese leaders meeting to ensure competition doesn't spiral out of control. History suggests rising versus ruling power tensions are very hard to navigate without conflict, but not impossible if wisdom prevails. For everyday people, understanding the US-China dynamic is becoming as important as understanding domestic politics, because it influences the cost of goods, the industries that will thrive or falter. For example, if tariffs continue, maybe more manufacturing comes back to the US, affecting jobs. Or if relations improve, perhaps more US companies expand in China, etc. And even questions of peace and war that hang over the future. In sum, the world is at an inflection point. We're living history, not just reading about it. Dalio's analysis of current events against the backdrop of past cycles suggests we should be prepared for a period of potentially rapid change, with high stakes for getting decisions right. The outcome isn't predetermined. Good choices by leaders and citizens could ease the transition, while missteps or hubris could lead to crisis. This is why his book is not just history, but a call to learn from history. Navigating the changing world order. What can we do? All this talk of cycles, history, and potential conflict can be intimidating. The natural question is, so what now? How should we use this knowledge? Dalio's goal with his book is not to just describe what's happening, but to help people and leaders navigate the change. While we as individuals can't control global events, we can make choices to better position ourselves and encourage our communities and countries to make wise decisions. Here are some key takeaways and principles for dealing with a changing world order, distilled from Dalio's insights. 1. Embrace reality and history. Don't deny it. Understand the situation as it is. It's comforting to think that our country will always be on top, or that this time is different. But a core principle is to look at reality head on. That means recognizing, for example, that the US has some serious problems to address, or that China's rise is real and significant. It means not sticking our heads in the sand. It also means studying history as a guide. History gives us a range of scenarios of what can happen. While the exact future won't copy the past, it will likely rhyme with it. So, educate yourself on past transitions and financial crises. They will make you far more prepared to interpret the news and signals today. As Dalio often says, understanding what is happening is more than half the battle of dealing with it. 2. Don't grow complacent, stay adaptive. One lesson of great powers declining is they got complacent, assuming success would continue automatically. For us as individuals or businesses, the same applies. Just because a strategy worked for the last 30 years doesn't mean it will for the next 30. The world could change rapidly. Be ready to adapt your approaches. For example, if you're an investor heavily concentrated in one country or one type of asset, recognize that could be a vulnerability if the cycle turns. Flexibility is a strength. Just as successful nations rose by being flexible and innovative, individuals should remain lifelong learners, willing to change opinions with new evidence and quick to adopt better ways of doing things. 3. Diversify your finances and risks. Dalio is a big proponent of diversification. This means not having all your eggs in one basket, especially when facing big unknowns. For investors, this could mean diversifying across different asset classes, stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, etc., and different regions of the world. If you hold all your investments in the US, for instance, consider having some global exposure, perhaps some European or Asian investments or assets like gold, that historically hold value if paper money is devalued. Diversification also applies to currency exposure. If all your savings are in one currency, you might consider whether holding a portion in other currencies or intangible assets could hedge against a decline in your home currency's value. The key idea is, you don't want a scenario where one dramatic event, like a currency reset, a market crash, or a political crisis, wipes you out. By spreading risk, you improve your ability to weather storms. 4. Prepare for tail risks, the low probability but high impact events. In times of great change, the range of possible outcomes is wider than usual. Things that seemed unimaginable during stable times can actually happen. Who would have predicted negative interest rates or a pandemic shutting down the global economy? Dalio suggests contemplating scenarios that are unlikely but not impossible and asking, am I prepared for that? For example, what if inflation in your country suddenly spikes and your cost of living doubles? What if a cyber attack freezes the banking system for a while? What if there's a geopolitical clash that disrupts travel or trade? You can't prepare for everything, but you can have contingency plans. This might mean having an emergency fund, keeping some physical cash or assets as backup, or simply mental preparation that helps avoid panic. Think of it like a fire drill for your finances and life plans you hope never to need it, but it's wise to have thought it through. 5. Focus on trends and fundamentals, not noise. Day-to-day news can be overwhelming and misleading. One day markets are euphoric, the next day panicked. To navigate big changes, keep an eye on fundamental trends. Is a country's debt growing faster than its economy? Is technology dramatically changing an industry's outlook? Are people becoming more or less unified? These big picture trends will tell you more about the future than short-term fluctuations or political theatre. For instance, the US stock market might hit new highs, but if that's happening while debt mounts and social unrest grows, those highs might not be sustainable. Conversely, a country might be going through short-term pain, but if it's investing in education and tech and cleaning up its financial problems, its long-term future might be bright. As an investor or citizen, align your decisions with long-term fundamentals. Dalio often uses the analogy of a sound economic foundation being like the strength of a building. Don't be fooled by how fancy the wallpaper is if the beams are rotten. 6. Build resilience nationally and personally. For nations, Resilience means things like sustainable finances, avoiding huge deficits unless absolutely necessary, strong alliances, and social cohesion. For individuals, resilience means having the capacity to absorb shocks. This includes financial resilience, savings, insurance, prudent use of debt, but also emotional and skills-based resilience. In a changing world, your job or industry could be disrupted. Do you have skills to adapt or pivot to a new career if needed? Are you willing to learn new technologies or even move to where opportunities are? Also, nurture your support networks, family, friends, community. In tough times, these networks are invaluable, and you can be invaluable to others. Health is another aspect. Taking care of your health is critical, because a personal health crisis can coincide with external crises to make life very hard. Control the variables you can control in your life. 7. Demand and support wise leadership. While we can't individually change the course of a nation, collectively citizens have influence. Use your voice and vote to encourage policies that address the root issues, not just the symptoms. This means supporting leaders who focus on education, infrastructure, and prudent economic management, those who are forward-looking and uniters, not dividers. In times of stress, it's easy for politics to slide into populism or extreme partisanship. But remember, societies that pulled through tended to have leaders and citizens who found compromise and common purpose. Think of the post-World War II consensus in many countries that led to rebuilding and growth. In your company or local community, you can also lead by example by fostering cooperation and long-term thinking. Essentially, don't feed the division, feed solutions and solidarity. 8. Stay informed but keep calm. Knowledge is power, but panic is counterproductive. Stay informed about global trends, read analysis from multiple perspectives, follow economic indicators, pay attention to international news, not just domestic, but don't let a constant barrage of alarming news paralyze you. There's a balance. Be neither the ostrich, head in sand, ignoring warning signs, nor the hysterical chicken little, running around saying the sky is falling at every turn. The goal of understanding these cycles is to make better decisions, not to live in fear. Remember that humanity has gone through massive changes repeatedly. Even when empires fell or systems collapsed, there was a morning after, and rebuilding began. People are resourceful, and life goes on. This perspective can give you a certain calm, even amid uncertainty. Yes, things may get tough, but we can get through it. 9. Look for opportunities in transitions. A changing world order isn't just about avoiding downside, it's also about seizing upside. New leaders and new technologies emerge during tumultuous times. For example, if one economy falters and another rises, there may be opportunities for investment or career moves in the ascending economy. Or if an old industry is in decline, a new one, like renewable energy or digital services, might be the future to jump into. Many successful investors actually make fortunes during recessions or transitions by buying assets when others are fearful. Entrepreneurs can solve problems that arise in crises. For instance, the need for remote work tools soared during the COVID pandemic, creating huge opportunities for those who provided solutions. The key is to keep a hopeful, curious eye out for what's next. What worked in the last era might not in the next, but something will. Aim to be a pioneer or early adopter in whatever that is, rather than clinging to the past. 10. Keep principles and purpose in sight. Dalio titled his book Principles for a reason. In uncertain times, having a compass of principles and a clear sense of purpose will guide you when detailed maps are lacking. For nations, principles might be rule of law, equality of opportunity, and meritocracy. Sticking to these can help navigate change without losing what's best about a society. For individuals, your principles might include integrity, fairness, and continuous learning. If you commit to never compromising your integrity, You won't chase get-rich-quick schemes that violate your values even if times get desperate. If you value learning, you'll proactively acquire knowledge that keeps you relevant. Purpose is also important. Remember what you're ultimately striving for, perhaps to provide for family, to create something meaningful, to help your community. That can motivate you to adapt rather than give up. People and nations with strong guiding principles tend to handle storms better because they have an internal anchor. Now, speaking more broadly and from the heart, yes, the idea that the comfortable world we know might change is unnerving. But knowledge is empowerment. By understanding how world orders change, you have an intellectual toolkit that many others don't. You can be proactive instead of reactive. Instead of being shocked when the next big financial crisis or geopolitical event happens, you can say, "This fits the pattern I've learned. Here's likely what's coming and how I can adjust." That's a huge advantage. Also, remember that after winter comes spring. The cyclic nature of history means no downturn or conflict is permanent. They eventually give rise to renewal. The 2020s may bring trials, but they may also bring breakthroughs in medicine, in clean energy, in perhaps a more multipolar but cooperative global system if we're wise. Crises can catalyze improvement. For example, the Great Depression led to financial safeguards, FDIC insurance, etc., and social safety nets that stabilized society. World War II new ways to thrive economically without constant growth, or forge new alliances for global health. The possibilities are also there. By preparing ourselves, we not only protect what we have, but we position ourselves to be part of the rebuilding and renewal that follow. Instead of dreading change, we can view ourselves as agents within it, capable of steering at least our own little corner of the world towards something better. In practice, maybe this means adjusting your investment portfolio, but also perhaps teaching your kids about history and resilience so they grow up adaptable and informed. It could mean starting that business you've been thinking about that addresses a need you foresee growing, or even getting involved in local politics to bridge divides in your community, contributing to the internal strength of your nation in however small a way. The bottom line, use Dalio's template of understanding as a lens, not a prophecy. It's a lens that can help clarify what's happening and what might happen, so you can respond thoughtfully. And never lose sight that while cycles are powerful, human agency matters too. We learn, we invent, we sometimes avert disasters or at least bounce back from them with new wisdom. Conclusion: learning from the past, shaping the future. The grand sweep of history teaches us that change is the only constant. Empires rise to dazzling heights and then, often in slow motion, unravel before our eyes, usually to be replaced by something new, often better in some ways and more challenging in others. Ray Dalio's exploration of changing world orders is ultimately a reminder that we are not helpless passengers in this journey. We can learn the map drawn by those who came before. So what are the key takeaways we carry forward? First, humility and awareness. No nation, no matter how rich or powerful, is guaranteed to stay at the top forever. The US and the West have enjoyed a remarkable run, but history's pulse suggests that we should not take the future for granted. By acknowledging that reality, we open ourselves to thoughtful action instead of complacency. Likewise, if you live in a rising power like China or another country, recognize that the vigor of ascent comes with pitfalls. To avoid success can be transient if mismanaged. No matter who we are or where we are, understanding these cycles gives us a grounded perspective and reminds us to stay vigilant and open-minded. Second, unity and good policy matter immensely. A society that can stay cohesive, manage its finances prudently, invest in its people, and remain adaptable can extend its prosperity far beyond those that don't. If you're an investor or a citizen placing bets on the future, Bet on places and leaders that tackle problems head-on rather than deny them. Internal strength, education, infrastructure, innovation, social cohesion often decides external fate. Let that be a call to support improvements in schools, infrastructure, healthcare, and fairness wherever you are. Those are the bedrocks of a flourishing order. Countries that reinvigorate those strengths can surprise the world by renewing themselves, even when many think they're in decline. Third, adaptability and resilience on a personal level. The world may throw curveballs, a financial crisis here, a technological disruption there, perhaps even a geopolitical shake-up that changes the rules of trade or travel. By staying curious, flexible, and diversified in our pursuits, we turn what could be threats into opportunities, or at least into manageable challenges. Think of yourself as running your own little empire, your household or career. Apply the same principles that guide rising nations. Avoid too much debt. Keep learning and innovating in your skill set. Build good relationships, your personal alliances and community. Save for a rainy day, have reserves, and maintain healthy habits, a stable personal foundation. Then you'll be in a great position to thrive no matter what the macro environment brings. Lastly, optimism in the cycle of renewal. Yes, Dalio's book talks about daunting challenges, depressions, wars, declines, but it's not a prophecy of doom, it's a call to wisdom. Every end of an order, as painful as it is, has given birth to a new one, often with remarkable progress. The Renaissance blossomed after the Dark Ages. The economic boom of the 1950s came after the war. The tech revolution came after the stagnation of the 1970s. Humanity keeps advancing, often in leaps after stumbles. By understanding the stumbles, we can better navigate to the next leap. We should take heart in our species' ability to learn and adapt. As long as we don't blow ourselves up, there's a good chance we'll solve many of the problems that worry us today. Imagine yourself a few decades from now, looking back at today. Will you be able to say, I saw the signs and prepared, and I wasn't blindsided? I even took advantage of new trends and came out stronger. Will we, as societies, be able to say, we recognized the need to adjust and we avoided the worst outcomes, leaving a better world for the next generation? Those are the outcomes we strive for. In closing, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order arms us with a historical compass and practical principles at a time when many feel the compass is lost. The world stage may be resetting, but with the knowledge of cycles and human nature, we have our bearings. Change can be frightening, but it's also a teacher and an opportunity. If we remain clear-eyed, proactive, and principled, we can not only survive the shifts in the world order, but also help shape what comes next into a brighter chapter. Let's take these lessons to heart. Whether you're an investor allocating your portfolio, an entrepreneur planning for the future, or simply someone trying to provide for your family in uncertain times, remember that understanding is power. The rise and fall of nations are epic stories, but they are built on countless individual choices. By making informed and wise choices ourselves, we become part of the force that drives positive renewal. The future belongs to those who prepare for it today. Armed with the insights from the past and an eye on the horizon, we can navigate the changing world order with confidence, prudence, and hope. Here's to learning from yesterday, acting wisely today, and thereby prospering tomorrow. Thank you for listening to this audiobook, and don't forget to subscribe. And if there's a book you'd like to hear on this channel, leave your suggestion in the comments.